The gavel slammed down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. All eyes turned toward the defendant's table, where 16-year-old Emma Hayes sat trembling, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, casting a cold, sterile glow over her flushed cheeks. She could feel the weight of the room pressing against her, dozens of strangers judging her every move, their whispers sharp as knives. At the bench, Judge Carleton leaned forward, his lips curling into a smug, almost amused smile. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps if you spent less time daydreaming and more time understanding the law, you wouldn't find yourself in this unfortunate predicament." Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words tangled somewhere deep in her throat. No one here knew the truth. No one knew who she really was. To them, she was just another shy, awkward teenager fumbling her way through an impossible situation. But they were wrong, because Emma wasn't just some nervous girl in over her head. She was a genius. And today, they were all about to find out. Emma Hayes had always been more comfortable in the background. At 16, she mastered the art of invisibility. Eyes cast down, hair draped like a curtain, shoulders hunched as if shrinking away from a world. While other girls her age obsessed over social media and school dances, Emma spent her nights surrounded by dusty textbooks and advanced mathematical theories that most college professors would find daunting. Numbers made sense. People didn't. Born in a small, sleepy town where everyone knew each other's business, Emma lived quietly with her father, Tom, a mechanic who worked long hours just to keep the lights on. Her mother had walked out when Emma was 7, leaving behind nothing but a half-empty closet, and a daughter who learned early that silence hurt less than goodbye. With her father often exhausted and distracted, Emma found solace in knowledge. She wasn't just smart, she was extraordinary, boasting an IQ of 220. But brilliance like hers wasn't exactly celebrated in a town where the future meant inheriting the family store or leaving for the nearest factory job. At school, she was a weird girl. Teachers dismissed her for being too quiet. Students ignored her unless they needed homework answers. Even her guidance counselor suggested she set realistic goals, as if applying to top universities was beyond someone like her. So Emma retreated deeper into her own world, building complex algorithms and decoding quantum theories in her notebook while the chaos of high school life raged around her. But all that had come crashing down 2 weeks ago. It started with an innocent favor. Mr. Collins, her father's longtime friend and owner of the town's only computer repair shop, had asked Emma to help fix some corrupted files on his office server. She'd done it in under an hour, no big deal. But someone somewhere accused her of hacking into sensitive documents she didn't even know existed. Police showed up. There were questions, handcuffs, an overnight stay in a holding cell that smelled like mildew and regret. And now here she was, sitting in a courtroom that felt more like a stage, with Judge Carleton treating her like a criminal. Carleton had a reputation, a man who enjoyed belittling anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Emma had watched him tear down adults twice her age. What chance did a shy teen girl stand? In the pews behind her sat her father, his face pale and drawn. He kept mouthing, "It'll be okay," but Emma could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did she. At least, not yet, because Emma was about to prove them all wrong. The courtroom air felt thick, pressing against Emma's chest like an unseen weight. Every shuffle of paper and cough in the audience ricocheted in her ears as Judge Carleton adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, looking down at her with that same smirk that made her stomach twist. "Miss Hayes," he began, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room, "I assume you understand the severity of the charges brought against you?" Emma nodded slightly, though her throat felt dry as sand. "Yes, Your Honor," she whispered. "Good. Then perhaps you can explain why someone with your limited background," he paused, glancing meaningfully at the threadbare sweater she wore, "would think it appropriate to access restricted files belonging to this court's private server." Emma blinked. The court server? That was the first time she'd heard that. She thought she was being accused of hacking Mr. Collins' business system. But this was something much bigger. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Her father shifted uncomfortably behind her, whispering to their overworked public defender, who only shrugged as if to say, "I'm as lost as you are." Emma's mind raced. How had helping Mr. Collins with his simple file corruption fix spiraled into accusations of tampering with court records? She'd only restored some damaged data. Basic stuff, really. But if what the judge was implying was true, someone had used her as a pawn. And if she didn't figure out who, she could be facing years behind bars. Judge Carlton tapped his gavel again, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Well, do you deny your involvement?" Emma hesitated, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to let the lawyer handle it. But the lawyer wasn't doing much of anything. And in that terrifying moment, as the entire courtroom waited for her answer, something shifted inside her. For the first time, the fear that had always ruled her life gave way to something else. Focus. She lifted her chin slightly. "I didn't access the court's files," she said, louder than she expected. "But if someone did, I can prove who it was." A murmur spread through the crowd like a spark on dry grass. Judge Carlton's eyebrow arched. "Oh, and what exactly qualifies you to conduct such an investigation?" Emma met his gaze directly. "I have an IQ of 220. I know how to trace digital fingerprints. And if you give me access to the data in question, I can show you exactly who hacked your system." Silence. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. "Well, Miss Hayes," he said at last, the condescension fading just slightly from his voice. "This should be interesting." And just like that, the shy, invisible girl everyone overlooked had been given a chance. A dangerous one, but a chance nonetheless. Emma sat alone in the courthouse's tiny records room, staring at the monitor in front of her. Judge Carlton had reluctantly granted her 24 hours to comb through the system's back-end under strict supervision. An officer hovered near the door, arms crossed, watching her every keystroke. The pressure was suffocating. One wrong move, and they'd slap the cuffs back on her wrists. But Emma didn't have time for nerves anymore. For years, she'd hidden her genius like it was something shameful. It was easier that way. Easier to be invisible than to explain why no one else seemed to understand the things that came naturally to her. Easier not to correct her teachers when they made mistakes or hide the fact that calculus felt like a second language. In this town, the less different you were, the safer you stayed. But now it was the only thing standing between her and a future in a prison cell. She took a deep breath, fingers flying across the keyboard, scanning the server's digital logs. A pattern emerged almost immediately. Someone had slipped in through a masked IP address, but the breadcrumbs were sloppy. Emma leaned closer. Whoever framed her wasn't as clever as they thought. Behind her, Officer Daniels shifted and cleared his throat. "You really understand all that?" he asked, peering over her shoulder. Emma nodded without looking away from the screen. "It's just like solving a puzzle." Daniels chuckled. "When I was your age, puzzles meant jigsaw pieces. Not whatever this is." Emma allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The first since this nightmare began. But that brief moment of lightness was crushed hours later, when the trail she was following hit a dead end. The activity logs had been wiped past a certain point, like someone knew exactly where she would look and covered their tracks. She sat back in the chair, rubbing her temples. For the first time since taking this on, doubt crept in. What if she couldn't prove anything? What if they really believed she did it? What if she failed? She closed her eyes. Think, Emma. There's always a back door. Always. That night, back home in their small kitchen, her father placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of her. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said gently. "We can get a real expert involved. Maybe someone from the state." Emma looked at him, his face worn and tired from years of hard labor and too little sleep. He'd sacrificed so much to raise her alone. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about proving she belonged in a world that kept telling her she didn't. "I have to," she said softly. "It's the only way anyone will take me seriously." Her father nodded, pride flickering in his eyes. "You're braver than you know." Fueled by his quiet support, Emma returned to court the next morning with renewed determination. She requested access to external connection logs, something most people wouldn't even consider. When Carlton skeptically agreed, Emma dug deeper than anyone had expected. And that's when she found it. An outgoing file transfer at the exact moment the court's documents were tampered with, sent to an email address registered to Mr. Collins. Her stomach dropped. Mr. Collins, the man who'd asked for her help, her father's friend, the man she'd trusted. At the next hearing, Emma requested permission to present her findings. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Judge Carlton eyed her curiously as she connected her laptop to the projector. Emma's voice trembled at first, but with each slide, each log entry, and each timestamp, she found her confidence growing. "This," she said, highlighting the connection records, "shows the moment someone accessed the restricted court files. And this," she pointed to the final slide, "is the destination they were sent to, an account tied directly to Mr. Collins' business server." Gasps rippled through the room. Mr. Collins sat frozen, his complexion paling. Carlton leaned forward. "Mr. Collins, do you have an explanation?" Collins stammered, then shook his head, as if the words wouldn't come. The judge looked back at Emma. "And you, Miss Hayes, how did you manage to uncover this?" She hesitated, then shrugged slightly. "I just followed the data." The judge's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time, it wasn't patronizing or dismissive. But it wasn't over yet. In the days that followed, Emma faced backlash she hadn't expected. Whispers in the school hallway became louder. "Who does she think she is? Collins would never do that." Some people didn't want to believe her, even with the proof laid bare. He was a respected member of the community. She was just a quiet, awkward girl who never spoke up. The weight of their doubt pressed on her like a storm cloud. But then came the small victories. Her computer science teacher, Mr. Lang, stopped her after class one afternoon. "Emma, I had no idea you were working at that level. You ever thought about entering national coding competitions? You could win scholarships. Big ones." She blinked and used a praise. I hadn't really thought about it." "Well, you should. You're going to go far. Don't let small-town minds tell you otherwise." And there was her father, who started looking at her not just as his little girl, but as someone extraordinary. "I'm sorry I never realized how brilliant you are," he told her one night over dinner. "Your mom leaving? I think I spent so much time trying to keep us afloat. I didn't see it." Emma smiled softly. "You always believed in me. That's enough." But perhaps the most surprising moment came from Judge Carlton himself. Weeks later, after the charges against her were dropped and Collins was officially indicted, Carlton called her back into his chambers. "I underestimated you, Miss Hayes," he admitted, his tone sincere. "Your abilities are remarkable. If you ever consider a career in law or cybersecurity, you have quite the future." She left the courthouse that day feeling lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her life, Emma wasn't hiding. She was standing tall, and the world was finally paying attention. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courthouse buzzed with electric tension Emma could feel from the moment she stepped inside. Reporters had shown up. Word spread beyond the sleepy town about the teenage girl who'd cracked a case that baffled the authorities. But none of that mattered to Emma. Today it wasn't about proving she was smart. It was about defending the truth, no matter the cost. And yet, as she stood outside the courtroom doors, her palms damp and her heart pounding against her ribs, doubt crept in. Would anyone believe her? Would they really take her side over Mr. Collins, a man everyone respected, trusted, and had known for decades? What if exposing him meant turning the entire town against her and her father? What if, even after all her work, people still dismiss her as just a quiet, awkward girl with impossible ideas. Her father touched her shoulder gently. "Hey, you don't have to do this alone." Emma looked up at him. For the first time, she realized he wasn't just proud of her. He needed her to believe in herself the way he always had. "I know," she whispered, "but I want to." Inside, the courtroom was packed. Mr. Collins sat at the defendant's table, his face pale, his fingers tapping anxiously against the polished wood. Judge Carleton, stern as ever, called the room to order. "Miss Hayes," the judge said, his tone unreadable, "you've requested the opportunity to present your final evidence before we proceed." Emma rose slowly, clutching her flash drive. Her knees trembled as she crossed the room, but her voice didn't waver when she spoke. "Yes, Your Honor." She connected her laptop to projector, breathing deeply as the first slide appeared on the screen. A detailed map of the data trail. The room hushed. Emma began to explain, carefully and clearly, how the tampering had been executed, step by step. She pointed out the discrepancies in the server logs, the fingerprints left in the code, the outgoing transfer Mr. Collins had tried to erase. And then she revealed the final piece, a recorded phone call. Unbeknownst to Collins, when he'd asked her for help that day, Emma had kept a recording, a precaution she took whenever doing freelance tech work, thanks to years of paranoia about her skills being exploited. On the recording, Collins mentioned needing access to some files downtown and joked that no one would suspect a shy little girl. The courtroom was silent. Collins' face drained of color. Emma pressed pause and turned to the judge. "This wasn't just about me fixing his server," she said. "He used me as a cover. And when things went wrong, I was the easiest one to blame." The judge nodded slowly. "And you are absolutely certain of these findings?" "I am," Emma said, standing straighter than she ever had before. "I've checked them from every angle. This is the truth." For a long moment, Judge Carleton simply stared at her. Then, to everyone's shock, he offered a rare, genuine nod of respect. "Thank you, Miss Hayes. You've done this court and this community a great service." As Collins was led away in handcuffs, the room erupted into murmurs. Emma returned to her seat beside her father, her heart still pounding. But for the first time, it wasn't from fear. It was pride, relief, victory. She had faced the people who doubted her, the man who tried to use her, and the voices in her own head that told her to stay small and silent. And she had won. The days following the hearing felt like waking up in someone else's life. Emma had spent so long trying not to be noticed that the sudden flood of attention was almost too much to process. News articles called her a teen prodigy and the quiet genius who saved the court. People in town who had never given her a second glance suddenly stopped her in the grocery store or whispered as she passed, as if seeing her for the very first time. But it wasn't the attention that mattered most to Emma. It was the freedom. For the first time in her life, she no longer felt trapped by her own brilliance. For years, she had thought being smart made her an outsider. She hid her talents, afraid of how people would judge her, afraid of standing out too much in a town that praised simplicity and tradition over ambition and curiosity. But now she realized that her gift wasn't something to fear. It was something to use. And that understanding changed everything. A week after the case closed, Judge Carleton himself requested a meeting. Emma was surprised when the invitation arrived. Even more so when she found herself sitting in his chambers, across from the man who had once publicly humiliated her. He was different this time, warmer, somehow less rigid. "I owe you an apology," he said, adjusting his glasses as he leaned forward on his desk. "I misjudged you, Miss Hayes, and I believe our entire system nearly failed because of it." Emma blinked. She wasn't expecting him to be so direct. "It's okay," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure if it really was. "No," Carleton replied firmly. "It's not, but perhaps you'll allow me to make it right. There's a statewide cybersecurity internship program. It's highly competitive. I've already contacted the director on your behalf. With your skills, I imagine you'd be at the top of their list. Emma felt her heart skip. Me? Yes, you. He smiled just slightly. I think it's time you stopped hiding and started leading. Emma left the courthouse that day feeling taller than she ever had. The weight of years spent shrinking herself had finally lifted. At home, her father was waiting at the kitchen table, his old work boots kicked off and his face tired from another long shift. When she told him about the internship, his eyes glistened. I knew you were meant for more than this town, he said. I just didn't know how to help you get there. Emma shook her head. You already did. You believed in me. That's what mattered. They sat together in silence for a while, the quiet, comfortable for once. Then, in a rare moment of impulse, Emma pulled out her laptop. Want to see what I'm working on next? She asked. And for the first time, her father leaned in, eager to understand the brilliant, unstoppable mind of his daughter. Weeks passed. Emma accepted the internship and began commuting to the city 3 days a week. There, surrounded by people who spoke her language, of code, of systems, of cybersecurity, and endless innovation, she felt like she belonged. She wasn't the shy girl in the back of the classroom anymore. She was Emma Hayes, the girl who had taken on a corrupt businessman, defended herself in a court of law, and won. But she didn't forget where she came from. One afternoon, just as summer began to stretch into fall, Emma returned to her old high school. Mr. Lang, her computer science teacher, had invited her to speak to his class. Standing in front of students who had once barely noticed her, Emma told her story, not just about the trial or the hacking or the evidence, but about the years before that, the years of feeling like she had to dim her own light to fit in, the years she spent thinking that staying quiet was safer than standing out. If I've learned anything, she finished, her voice steady, it's that your talents are not mistakes. They're not things to hide. They're gifts. And even if people don't understand them at first, you have to believe in them enough for everyone else. Because you never know when the thing that makes you different is exactly what the world needs. The classroom applauded. Mr. Lang beamed with pride. And Emma, standing at the front of the room where she'd once sat silently in the back, felt something deeper than pride. She felt peace. Because in the end, this wasn't just about proving her innocence or exposing crime. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself she'd buried long ago, about realizing that being different wasn't her weakness. It was her superpower. And in sharing that with others, she finally understood the true meaning of strength. It wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about having the courage to be fully, unapologetically yourself. And that was just the beginning. 2 years later, Emma stood on the balcony of her small city apartment, overlooking the skyline that once felt impossibly far from her quiet hometown. She was now a full-time analyst at a leading cybersecurity firm, working on projects that protected thousands of people from digital threats most didn't even know existed. Occasionally, when the city lights blurred into a soft glow against the night, her mind drifted back to that courtroom. The wooden benches, the way 100 eyes on her, and the moment she chose to speak up rather than shrink back. That decision had changed everything. What surprised her most wasn't how the world had opened up to her since then, but how her own heart had. She no longer feared being too smart or too different. She had found people who celebrated her mind, mentors who guided her, and friends who understood her without needing her to explain. Back home, Judge Carlton had become an unlikely ally, inviting her back regularly to speak about digital ethics and youth empowerment. Her father, still working long hours, now joked about being the dad of the genius to anyone who'd listen. And Emma? She finally learned that real power didn't come from hiding what made her unique. It came from sharing it. For anyone feeling invisible, overlooked, or underestimated, she wished she could tell them what she now knew to be true. Sometimes the world won't see your worth until you demand they do. And when you finally step into your brilliance, you don't just change your life. You change everything around you.